Welcome back to the UK. As the first stop on our tour, London saw us through some major jet lag, extreme excitement, and many wonderful food experiences. Although England is not necessarily known for creating any standout national dishes, London serves as a melting pot and a place where many foreign delicacies have been tested and perfected. One of England's most significant colonies was India, and while this acquisition led to plenty of other important things, let's focus on curry. Popularized by Queen Victoria, this traditional Indian dish quickly became a staple food in England, and we were lucky enough to learn how to cook it at the highly acclaimed Waitrose Cooking School. We made the curry paste from scratch. We started by cutting up the different ingredients in the paste and putting them into a food processor. Once the ingredients had been finely chopped, the coconut cream was added to the food processor last. It was added last because over-whipping the cream would result in separation of the components. The proteins in the raw chicken were denatured through the heating process. The chicken cooked with the paste and coconut milk, adding flavor to the meat. This means that the proteins unfolded from their natural form, and this can be seen in the way that the chicken turns white during the cooking process. When beginning to make the rice must be rinsed before it is put in the pot. The rinsing removes any excess starch that causes the rice to be sticky. Once rinsed, the rice can be put into the pot and brought to a boil, then brought down to low heat to cook. For the cucumber relish, the ingredients were chopped and mixed together, and then a mixture of sugar and white wine vinegar were added over the top. When tasting the relish, it was both sweet and tangy. The sugar had dissolved in the white wine vinegar through the process of heating it. The sugar was able to dissolve in the white wine vinegar because the table sugar molecule has a similar ratio of hydrogen bonds to carbons to the white wine vinegar. Now on to one of my favorite parts of the trip, the Walk Eat Talk Eat tour. We were taken around East London, where we learned about the interesting and sometimes frightening history while munching on local treats. The stop that stood out the most to Melissa, Morgan, and I was our final one, where we were given these chocolate donuts, and because of how great they tasted, we decided to look into exactly how they were created. When making donuts, a common ingredient used is yeast. Yeast helps dough to rise by fermenting sugars within the dough and releasing carbon dioxide, which creates air pockets within the dough. This gives the donut a soft, spongy texture. The yeast must often first be activated by adding it to warm water, and then it can be added to the flour and sugar mixture. The yeast will feed on the sugar to produce the carbon dioxide bubbles in the dough. The dough must then be kneaded to distribute the yeast through the dough to create even rising. This will also strengthen the strands of gluten, allowing the donuts to hold their shape. The dough must then be left to rise before it's fried. The frying process of making a donut adds a lot of moisture and fat. First, for these donuts, they were shaped into a ball. Then the donut is dropped into boiling oil. The oil is so hot that it causes the water inside of the dough to evaporate, which creates a void in the donut that the oil fills. The oil also cooks the dough, which creates a crispy outside and a soft, spongy inside. These donuts were filled with chocolate cream, most likely made from a mixture of heated cream and chocolate. The cream was inserted by poking a hole in the side of the already fried donut and piping in the cream to the spongy space inside of the donut. A chocolate glaze was also added to top off the donut.
The cuisine in Paris was much more detailed than that of the cuisine in London. For instance, we took pastry making classes in Paris, in which we learned the specific steps to achieve perfect choquettes and macaroons. It became very apparent in these classes that technique and detail are two extremely important parts of crafting French pastries, and these delightful pastries are a large part of French culture. In London, pastries were not as largely emphasized as they were in Paris, and that can only be true because pastry making is truly an art that the French have mastered. During our first pastry class, we learned how to make choquettes. The choquette batter is used to make cream puffs and eclairs. The batter was called pâte à choux. The water in the batter activates the proteins, which makes the batter more pliable. The gluten within the flour allows the choquette to hold its structure when it's rising in the oven. The eggs both thicken the batter and allow the eclair or cream puff to rise by trapping the air. The butter adds a flaky texture, while the fat in the butter contributes to the rising of the dough when it is reabsorbed into the dough during the cooking process. The water contributes to this as well. When making the batter, care must be taken to add the eggs one at a time after removing the butter, water, and flour from the heat. If the eggs are added when the mixture is too hot, or if they are added too fast, the eggs will begin to cook. This means that proteins would uncurl from their natural state or be denatured. This creates chunkiness within the batter, and it cannot be undone. Once all of the ingredients are mixed together, they are piped into the correct shape and then baked. They rise through the cooking process into their final form. The macaroons require much more attention than choquettes because they have no gluten to hold shape during cooking. They are made of almond flour, which is gluten-free and light. This helps allow the pastry to be puffy. The egg whites in the mixture are whipped to peaks in order to trap air and contribute to the puffiness as well. This is because the proteins in the egg whites are in a relaxed state once they are whipped, which allows the egg whites to hold a structure in which air pockets are dispersed throughout. The white sugar for the macaroons is heated in a water liquid state so that it is more easily combined with the egg whites. The sugar mixture is added slowly as not to cook the egg whites. The water in the sugar mixture contributes to the rising of the pastry in the same way it did in the choquettes. It reabsorbs into the batter during the baking process, leaving pockets of air. When the egg and sugar mixture is added to the flour and confectioner's sugar mixture, it is done by the process of folding. The wet mixture is slowly added into dry, small increments. This is done in order to maintain the fluffy texture of the mixture that the egg whites is created. If the batter is overmixed, the pastry will not rise correctly. Our time in Paris taught us how important the details of pastry making are to the final product. From learning how to temper mixtures to learning about incorporating air into the mixtures, these steps can change the entire outcome of the finished product. In French cooking, it is critical to follow the recipe in its very specific way. This explains the difference in why pastries like croissants taste slightly different in France than they do in the States.
Food in America more recently seems to be focused on various health concerns and nourishing your body. However, we also definitely enjoy our sweets. America, because of the melting pot it is, has many of its own twists on traditional recipes from other cultures. For instance, this gluten-free donut recipe. It was originally taken from a paleo recipe, which means that it would only include whole foods such as produce and meat, and no dairy, grains, or processed food. I modified this recipe to include dairy since the fat and butter and milk impart a more rich flavor. Unlike the chocolate donuts in London, these donuts are not made with yeast or gluten. These donuts are made with a chemical leavener and baked instead of fried. Donuts made like this generally have a texture closer to that of cake. For this recipe, the chemical leavener used to help the batter rise was baking soda. The flour mixture was made from coconut flour and almond flour. Coconut flour is very light, which helps create the fluffy texture. The almond flour helps hold the structure because it is a heavier flour with protein, though still gluten-free. To sweeten the batter, both honey and vanilla extract were used. The fat from the butter and milk also help create a spongy texture in the donut by melting during the baking process and leaving air pockets. The eggs in the batter also act as a leavening agent by creating air pockets during the heating process. The donuts turned out very light, fluffy, and moist. However, they easily fell apart when picked up because of the lack of gluten. They were best eaten with a fork and a sugar and water glaze on top.
Although our time in London and Paris is over, we now walk away with the new knowledge of how these three places value their foods. London takes on a variety of cultures and textures, Paris is very detail-oriented and specific, and the United States is beginning to focus more on ingredients that are being used. However, we know that no matter how different foods are in these cultures, the same chemistry lies behind all of them.